bar's pretty high. In order to really create a new category of devices, those devices are going to have to be far better at doing some key tasks. They're going to have to be far better at doing some really important things. Better than the laptop, better than the smartphone. If there's going to be a third category of device, it's going to have to be better at these kinds of tasks than a laptop or a smartphone. Otherwise, it has no reason for being.
Last year I bought what I thought was going to be my most used device, a 12.9-inch iPad Pro, which at the time seemed like hardware from another planet, with Apple putting the same M1 chip into this device as their Macs. And I spent over $2,000 decking out this iPad Pro with upgrades and accessories. I mean, I even made sure to get the 1TB version of this device so I could have an iPad with 16GB of memory, because this thing was going to be with me 24/7. And there was definitely a bit of a honeymoon period with my iPad Pro. I have never seen a device that was so fast, paired with what I thought was the best display I have ever laid my eyes on, with its gorgeous 12.9-inch mini LED display complete with buttery smooth 120Hz ProMotion scrolling and animations. But even shortly after buying my iPad Pro, I went back and forth between that and my M1 iMac. The iPad Pro was a device I use often, but it was still a secondary device where the bulk of my productivity was still being done on the Mac. However, even though the iPad was always a secondary device for me, I still loved using it because the hardware always felt ahead of the Mac. And while at the time the M1 Macs caught up and now match the iPad Pro in performance, they still felt older and lacked the bleeding edge hardware that I still found on the iPad Pro. That all changed when Apple unveiled their new MacBook Pros. For the first time in a long time, these new Macs were outfitted with better hardware in almost every single way. So not only did you get more advanced Apple Silicon with the M1 Pro and M1 Max chips, but you also got screen quality that was even above the 12.9-inch iPad Pro, with the 14-inch MacBook Pro sporting a more refined mini LED display with not only more screen area, but less display blooming, and it was the first and still the only Mac to ever receive the smooth 120Hz ProMotion display. The design was also fresh. It had thinner bezels than the iPad Pro, and love it or hate it, it had a notch and a squared off body, even featured more ports than its predecessor. And like the M1 Max before it, these MacBooks also came with improved battery life, and I was able to get more battery life out of my MacBook Pro than my iPad, which is something that you would never be able to say during the old Intel days. The only ding I could possibly give the Mac was there was no touchscreen, but every other hardware advantage on the Mac was either on equal footing with the iPad Pro or surpassed it in some way. The days of the iPads being the bleeding edge of hardware for Apple was over. Suddenly, things I used to use my iPad for, like browsing the web, reading through emails, typing out notes, or even watching videos, all of those tasks that I used to deem my iPad better for, well, all of those tasks now felt easier and felt like less of a hassle to do just by opening the lid of my MacBook. My infrequent use with the iPad Pro only exacerbated this problem. Keeping it constantly connected to things like the Magic Keyboard and the Apple Pencil meant more battery drain and less standby time. And when I would go to grab my iPad Pro, there was a good chance that when I went to go open it up, the battery was already completely drained. And then it struck me. I'm not really using my iPad that much anymore. And it's not just the iPad Pro. I've tried other iPads out there thinking maybe I went astray getting a big iPad to replace what I would normally use my laptop for, only to find out that the laptop was the better solution. No, the same thing happened to the other smaller iPads like the new iPad mini and the new 10.9-inch M1 iPad Air. Sure, I would use those devices pretty frequently during their review periods, but when the weeks and months passed after that, I always came back to primarily using a combination of my MacBook Pro and my iPhone, bringing out even the small iPad mini, which I think has kept the purest form of the iPad experience, just didn't feel worth it at times. Often I felt like it was kind of needless to go back into the other room and grab it because the quick little bursts of entertainment or work that I would use this form factor for, well, it was often easier or quicker to just take the phone out of my pocket and do it there. In fact, the more I thought about making this video, the more I realized just how neglected the iPad has been in my current workflow. And maybe it's the same for you. Think about it. If you had to give up one Apple device right now, would it be your iPhone, your Mac, your Apple Watch? or your iPad? For me, I would give up the iPad because every task I could do on my iPad can also be done by using a combination of the iPhone and the MacBook. It made me also realize that what the iPad was originally pitched as, a third device that sits in the middle and does some tasks better than your iPhone and some tasks better than your Mac, it isn't necessarily true anymore. When I look at that original list, I start to question if the iPad is better at those tasks. When I look at that list, I think I much prefer to browse the web or answer emails on my Mac, or how I like to use my iPhone better for leisure things like listening to music or playing games. And while it may not have a big screen, it's primarily where I watch most of my video content, especially with the rise in short vertical video content like TikTok that is optimized for phone displays. The experience is no longer defaultly better on the iPad. And even enjoying photos, which should be a more enjoyable experience with the iPad's form factor, often isn't, because the way we look at photos has changed since the iPad was originally announced. It usually isn't done in the stock Photos app, but it's often done on social media, and apps like Instagram don't even have a native iPad app. Even if I tossed a few of these categories to the iPad out of sheer mercy, I mean, yes, ebooks are better on an iPad than on the Mac or the iPhone. You got me there. But if I really think about the way that I personally use my devices, I'm not sure the iPad is better at most of these tasks, at least in any meaningful way over a smartphone or a Mac. Listen, before you start typing away about how you use your iPad all the time or how there's advantages to it over a Mac, I get that. The iPad shares a number of unique advantages over the Mac, primarily in how simple it is to use and how it has a touchscreen. It is a huge advantage for most people because that's how most people use their computers. And it can also be a necessity for people like artists who use accessories like the Apple Pencil to create beautiful works of art. There are still some tasks where the iPad cannot be beat, especially in its price point. The iPad, at least without its expensive accessories, is priced much friendlier than the Mac. And good iPads start at ridiculously good price points. Good luck finding a new Mac for that little amount of money that you can buy the basic iPad for. And there are even some cool features that integrate the iPad into a really productive workflow, allowing you to use it as a second monitor with Sidecar, or even letting you run macOS on your iPad remotely. And Universal Control is such a mind-blowing feature that really combines the strengths of these products into one powerful workflow. But at the core of it all, iPad sales are down, and the iPad now represents the smallest money-making category in Apple's entire business model. Still, this video is a personal one, and as someone who used to be such a big iPad user back when I started this channel, I feel like the tides for me have shifted back to the Mac in a big way, and I think most users are feeling this too. The writing is on the wall, and something needs to change for the iPad to succeed. And that means it needs to become something that is better than the Mac or better than the phone to use for certain tasks. The timing of this video is no coincidence. I decided to publish this video a week before WWDC because there is a chance that Apple could address some of the shortcomings of the iPad to make it a product that I would want to use over the Mac. That could be things like rumored better multitasking, windowed applications, support for Apple's own Pro applications, or maybe, at a drastic measure, a hybrid mode that could switch between iPadOS for users who prefer a simple experience and then over to macOS for users that want and need everything a Mac can do. However, for me, it goes beyond even those small changes, because even little software details break the iPad experience for me. I can't count how many times I've been listening to music or watching a YouTube video on my iPad when scrolling through Twitter, only to have Twitter hijack the audio source with an auto-playing video as it completely pauses the other thing I was listening to. On the Mac, that just doesn't happen. You can have multiple audio feeds at once, and everything doesn't have to stop just because a 5-second ad popped up somewhere else. And there's also other changes, like things to like the file system, all that stuff. Listen, I don't want to make this into a video into a list of demands for iPadOS. I think that's well documented at this point. But I believe the iPad needs better software. It needs to evolve, it needs to compete against the Mac, and it definitely needs to offer experiences that make it better to use than a Mac. I am hopeful that we will see some of those changes with iPadOS 16, and I think this could be a make or break moment for the future of the iPad as a whole, because if we cannot match the amount of hardware power we now have with our iPads with equally compelling and capable software, I may never really see the point of using an iPad ever again.